Xylorp adjusted his 7 eye stalks, each one independently swiveling to focus on a different corner of the classroom. As the teacher of xenobiology 101 at the Galactic University of Sciences, he prided himself on maintaining order and decorum among his diverse student body. But today, as he peered at the motley crew of aliens before him, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Oh right, he thought sarcastically. We've got a Deathworlder in our midst. How could I forget? His gaze settled on the small, bipedal creature sitting in the front row. The human Jane, if he remembered correctly, was hunched over her desk, scribbling furiously in her notebook. Her wild mane of hair Xylorp still couldn't get over how much it resembled the poisonous frilltails of Gamma Centauri bobbed with each movement. Well, at least she's attentive, Xylorp mused, unlike some of my other students who seem to think this class is nap time. He shot a pointed look at Blurgax, the gelatinous blob from Beetlejuice V, who was currently oozing over 3 seats and emitting soft snores. Clearing his throat, all 7 of them, Xylorp addressed the class. All right, students. As you know, our end-of-term projects are due next week. I hope you've all been working diligently on your presentations about your home planet's unique biological adaptations. A chorus of groans and whistles filled the air. Xylorp's eye stalks twitched in annoyance. Yes, I know. The joy of academia. Now, let's have a few volunteers share their progress. Who wants to go first? Silence descended upon the room like a thick, awkward fog. Xylorp sighed internally. It's going to be one of those days, isn't it? To his surprise, a small hand shot up from the front row. Jane, the human, was practically bouncing in her seat with excitement. Ah, yes, Jane, our resident Deathworlder. Please enlighten us, as Xylorp said, his tone a mixture of curiosity and trepidation. Jane sprang to her feet, her eyes shining with an enthusiasm that Xylorp found both admirable and slightly terrifying. She bounded to the front of the room, carrying a large, mysterious bag. Thanks, Professor Z, Jane chirped, her voice filled with barely contained glee. So, for my project, I decided to focus on one of Earth's most fascinating biological phenomena, our drive to understand and harness the power of combustion. Xylorp's eye stalks froze. Combustion? Surely she doesn't mean. Now, I know what you're all thinking, Jane continued, grinning from ear to ear. Combustion. Isn't that like super dangerous? And you're absolutely right, but that's what makes it so exciting. The class erupted into a cacophony of alarmed squeaks, whistles, and gurgles. Blurgax, finally awake, oozed upright with a start, causing a nearby Venusian to leap onto their desk in fright. Xylorp raised all 14 of his appendages, trying to calm the class. Now, everyone. I'm sure Jane isn't suggesting anything. Reckless, he turned to the human, his voice stern. Are you Jane? Jane's grin only widened. Of course not, Professor. Safety first. That's the human way. She paused, then added with a wink. Well, safety eventually. Anyway, the professor's exoskeleton paled slightly. Perhaps we should move on to another student's presentation. But Jane was already reaching into her bag. Don't worry. I've got all the proper safety equipment. Goggles for everyone. Before Xylorp could protest, Jane was zipping around the room, distributing what looked like transparent force fields for the eyes. The alien students, a mixture of curious and terrified, tentatively accepted the strange devices. Now, Jane announced, returning to the front of the room, let's talk about the marvel of controlled explosions. For the next hour, the classroom became a whirlwind of activity, laughter, and the occasional screech of terror. Jane, with the boundless energy that seemed unique to her species, darted from desk to desk, demonstrating various safe chemical reactions that produced everything from colorful smoke to small, contained explosions. And this, she exclaimed, holding up a bubbling beaker, is what happens when you mix potassium chlorate with a gummy bear. The resulting reaction sent a jet of purple flame shooting towards the ceiling, eliciting a mix of awe and panic from the alien students. Xylorp, who had long since given up on maintaining order, simply watched with a mixture of horror and fascination. Isn't it beautiful? Jane sighed, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames. The rapid oxidation, the release of energy, the transformation of matter. It's like the universe is putting on a show just for us. Grelnak, a timid Andromedan with translucent skin, raised a trembling tentacle. But why would your species willingly create such dangerous reactions? Jane's laughter filled the room, a sound that somehow managed to be both melodious and slightly maniacal. Oh, Grelnak, my dear friend, it's not about the danger, it's about understanding. Every controlled explosion brings us one step closer to unraveling the mysteries of the universe. She paused, then added with a grin, plus, it's really fun. Xylorp, finally finding his voice, interjected, yes, well, I think we've had quite enough fun for one day, Jane, perhaps we should. But Jane was already onto her next demonstration. Now, who wants to see what happens when you combine liquid nitrogen with warm water? The resulting explosion of vapor caused 3 Rigelian students to molt prematurely and sent Blurgax oozing under his desk in terror. As the chaos unfolded, Xylorp couldn't help but marvel at the human's unbridled enthusiasm. It was reckless, yes. Potentially dangerous, Absolutely. But there was something undeniably captivating about Jane's approach to science. Perhaps, he thought, ducking to avoid a flying glob of some unidentified substance. This is why humans have advanced so quickly. They're not afraid to play with fire, quite literally. By the time the class period ended, the room looked like it had been hit by a small tornado. Smoke lingered in the air, desks were overturned, and more than a few students looked like they'd aged several years in the span of an hour. Jane, her hair singed and her face smudged with soot, beamed at her classmates. "So, what did you guys think? Pretty cool, right?" The alien students, still in various states of shock, could only stare at her in disbelief. Xylorp, realizing he needed to regain some semblance of control, cleared his throats. "Well, that was certainly informative. Jane, thank you for your explosive presentation." Jane's face lit up. "Thanks, Professor Z. I've got tons more experiments planned for next week. Wait until you see what happens when you mix." "That's quite all right," Xylorp interrupted hastily. "I think we've all learned more than enough about Earth's unique approach to science for one day." As the students filed out of the classroom, still buzzing with a mixture of excitement and lingering fear, Xylorp overheard snippets of their conversations. "Did you see the way she just touched the fire with her bare hands? I thought my exoskeleton was going to melt. Do you think all humans are like that? I need to transfer to a different class, or maybe a different planet." Xylorp sighed, his eye stalks drooping with exhaustion. It had been a long day, and he had a feeling it was only the beginning. As he gathered his materials, he noticed Jane lingering by the door, her eyes still sparkling with excitement. "Professor Z," she said, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant, "I hope I didn't cause too much trouble. It's just, I get so excited about science, you know. There's so much to discover, so much to explore." Xylorp studied the small human before him. Despite the chaos she had caused, he couldn't deny the pure, unbridled passion for knowledge that radiated from her. It was a trait he had seen in few students over his long teaching career. "Jane," he said, choosing his words carefully, "your enthusiasm is commendable. However, perhaps we could find a way to channel it that doesn't involve quite so many explosions." Jane's face fell for a moment, but then brightened again. "Oh, of course, I've got tons of other ideas. How about next time we explore the fascinating world of Earth's extreme offals? I brought some samples of bacteria from deep-sea hydrothermal vents." Xylorp's eye stalks shot up in alarm. "Samples? From where?" But Jane was already halfway out the door, her voice trailing behind her. "See you next week, Professor Z. It's going to be amazing." As the door closed behind her, Xylorp slumped into his chair, all 7 of his hearts pounding. He had a feeling that teaching Jane, and by extension understanding humans, was going to be the greatest challenge of his career. Controlled explosions, he thought, shaking his head in disbelief. What will these Deathworlders think of next? Little did he know, Jane's next project would involve demonstrating the principles of nuclear fission using household items. But that's a story for another day. The next week, as Xylorp approached his classroom, he could already hear the excited chatter of his students. It seemed that Jane's explosive presentation had sparked a newfound interest in xenobiology 101. Whether that interest was born of genuine scientific curiosity or morbid fascination remained to be seen. Taking a deep breath or 7, Xylorp steeled himself for whatever chaos awaited him beyond the door. As he entered, he was greeted by a sight that simultaneously filled him with dread and a grudging sense of admiration. Jane, true to her word, had transformed the classroom into a miniature deep-sea hydrothermal vent ecosystem. How she had managed to recreate the crushing pressures and extreme temperatures of the ocean floor in a standard university classroom was beyond Xylorp's comprehension. But there it was, complete with billowing black smokers, colonies of tube worms, and was that a giant isopod scuttling across the floor. "Professor Z," Jane called out cheerfully, waving from inside what appeared to be a makeshift submersible. "You're just in time. We were about to dive down to collect some samples of the extremophile bacteria." Xylorp's eye stalks swiveled wildly, trying to take in the scene before him. The other students he noticed were decked out in deep-sea diving gear, their alien physiologies comically distorted by the bulky suits. Xylorp began, his voice a mixture of exasperation and awe. "When I suggested finding alternatives to explosions, this wasn't quite what I had in mind." The humans' laughter echoed through the room, somehow managing to be heard over the hiss of superheated water vapors and the gurgle of simulated ocean currents. "Oh, come on, Professor Z, where's your sense of adventure? We're about to explore one of the most extreme environments on Earth. Well, a replica of it, anyway." Blurgax, who had apparently overcome his fear from the previous week, oozed excitedly in his diving suit. "This is fascinating," he burbled. "On my planet, we consider anything above freezing to be unbearably hot." Jane beamed at the gelatinous alien. "That's the spirit, Blurgax. Just wait until we get down there and start collecting samples. The bacteria we find can survive temperatures over 100 degrees Celsius and crushing pressures that would turn most organisms into organic pancakes." Grelnak, still looking nervous but undeniably intrigued, raised a tentacle. Biba Jane, how did you manage to recreate these conditions in our classroom? Surely it's not possible to. Jane interrupted with a wink. A good scientist never reveals all her secrets. Let's just say I called in a few favors from the engineering department and may have borrowed some equipment from the geology lab when no one was looking. Xexalorp felt a headache coming on in all 7 of his brains. Jane, please tell me you didn't. But his words were drowned out by a sudden rumble that shook the classroom. The simulated ocean floor began to shift, and plumes of magma, at least Xexalorp hoped it was simulated, began to seep through cracks in the recreated seafloor. Ooh, perfect timing, Jane exclaimed, clapping her hands in delight. Looks like we're in for some tectonic activity. Quick, everyone. Grab your sample collection kits. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to study extremophiles in a dynamic environment. As the alien students scrambled to follow Jane's instructions, Xexalorp couldn't help but marvel at the scene unfolding before him. Here were beings from across the galaxy, each adapted to their own unique environments, working together to study one of the most inhospitable regions of Earth. And at the center of it all was Jane. Her enthusiasm infectious, her curiosity boundless. Perhaps, Xexalorp thought, this is the true power of humanity, not their resilience to harsh environments or their penchant for explosions, but their ability to inspire wonder and collaboration across species boundaries. His moment of reflection was abruptly interrupted by a jet of scalding water that narrowly missed his leftmost eye stalk. Oops. Sorry about that, Professor Z. Jane called out. Might want to step back a bit. Things are about to get a little volatile down here. Rare. As Xexalorp hastily retreated to what he hoped was a safe distance, he couldn't suppress a chuckle. Teaching Jane, and by extension, understanding humans, was proving to be the most exhilarating and terrifying experience of his long career. Controlled explosions, deep-sea vents. What's next? He mused. Antimatter containment experiments. The thought had barely formed in his mind when he heard Jane's voice rise above the chaos. Hey, Professor Z, for next week's class, I was thinking we could explore the fascinating world of particle physics. How do you feel about building a small hadron collider? Xexalorp's exoskeleton paled. It was going to be a long semester. As the weeks passed, Jane's presentations became the stuff of legend across the Galactic University campus. Students from other departments would crowd around the door of xenobiology 101, hoping to catch a glimpse of the latest Earth-inspired spectacle. There was the time Jane decided to demonstrate Earth's diverse ecosystems by transforming the classroom into a series of rapidly shifting biomes. One moment, students were sweltering in a simulated Sahara desert. The next, they were shivering in an Antarctic tundra. More than a few alien physiologies were pushed to their limits that day, and the university's environmental control systems never quite recovered. Then there was the infamous evolution acceleration chamber incident. Jane's attempt to compress millions of years of evolutionary processes into a single class period resulted in the creation of a new species of hyper-intelligent mold that tried to stage a coup of the biology department. It took weeks for the hazmat team to fully decontaminate the building, and to this day, students swear they can hear the mold plotting its revenge in the ventilation systems. But perhaps the most talked about event was the day Jane decided to tackle the subject of Earth's magnetic field. Her small demonstration involved creating a miniature magnetosphere in the classroom, complete with swirling plasma and auroral displays. The resulting electromagnetic pulse fried every piece of technology within a half-mile radius, leading to an impromptu campus-wide holiday that students affectionately dubbed the day the lights went out in Galactic U. Through it all, Xexalorp found himself oscillating between states of sheer panic and grudging admiration. There was no denying that Jane's methods were unorthodox, dangerous, and occasionally bordered on interplanetary incidents. But he couldn't argue with the results. Attendance in Xenobiology 101 had skyrocketed. Students who once dozed through lectures now arrived early, vibrating with anticipation for the day's lesson. Even Blurgax, who had once been content to ooze lazily across multiple seats, now quivered with excitement at the prospect of each new class. More importantly, the students were learning, not just about Earth and its myriad biological wonders, but about the scientific method, the importance of questioning assumptions, and the thrill of discovery. Jane's infectious enthusiasm had awakened a spark of curiosity in even the most apathetic of students. Of course, not everyone appreciated Jane's unique approach to education. The Dean of Sciences, a towering Arcturian with a penchant for traditional teaching methods, had taken to camping out in Xexalorp's office, his tentacles twitching with barely contained fury. This is unacceptable, Xexalorp the Dean bellowed, his voice causing ripples in Xexalorp's coffee cup. First, the explosion in the chemistry lab. Then, the unscheduled tectonic activity in the geology department. And now, I hear rumors of time dilation experiments in the physics building. This human is a menace. Xexalorp sighed, all 7 of his lungs expanding simultaneously. I understand your concerns, Dean Silthrak, but you can't argue with the results. Student engagement is at an all-time high, and our department's research output has tripled since Jane joined the class. The dean's eye stalks quivered with indignation. Results? Results. The entire campus is in chaos. Just yesterday, I caught a group of Venusian philosophy students trying to calculate the existential implications of quantum superposition using a homemade particle accelerator and a toaster oven. Xexilorp had to admit, that did sound like Jane's influence. I'll have a talk with her, he promised, not for the first time. We'll find a way to channel her enthusiasm into less destructive avenues. As if summoned by their conversation, a knock at the door heralded Jane's arrival. She bounded into the office, her hair singed and her lab coat covered in an iridescent substance that seemed to be slowly eating through the fabric. Professor Z. Dean Silthrak. You're just in time, Jane exclaimed, her eyes shining with that now familiar mix of scientific fervor and barely contained chaos. I've had the most brilliant idea for next week's class. How do you feel about exploring the concept of terraforming? The dean's tentacles went limp with horror. Terraforming? Surely you don't mean. Jane's grin widened. Exactly. We'll start small, of course. Just a minor atmospheric adjustment to the quad. I've already got the weather control satellites in place, and the engineering department has agreed to lend me their gravity manipulation equipment. It'll be amazing. Xexilorp watched as the dean's coloration shifted through a spectacular range of hues before settling on a sickly green. He almost felt sorry for the old Arcturian. Almost. Now Jane Xexilorp began, trying to inject a note of caution into his voice. Perhaps we should discuss this further before. But Jane was already halfway out the door, her voice trailing behind her. No time to lose. Professor Z's science waits for no one, not even on a Class 3 Deathworld. See you next week. As the door slammed shut, Xexilorp turned to face the dean, whose eye stalks had gone completely rigid with shock. Well, Xexilorp said, allowing a touch of amusement to creep into his voice, it seems we're in for an interesting semester. The dean could only sputter incoherently in response. As Xexilorp escorted the shell-shocked dean out of his office, he couldn't help but feel a twinge of excitement. Yes, Jane's methods were unconventional, bordering on the insane. Yes, there was a non-zero chance that her next experiment might accidentally kickstart a new Big Bang. But isn't that what science was all about? Pushing boundaries, challenging assumptions, and occasionally causing a minor cataclysm in the name of knowledge. Perhaps, Xexilorp mused, this is why humans have become such a force in the galaxy. They don't just adapt to the universe, they make the universe adapt to them. As he settled back into his chair, Xexilorp found himself looking forward to next week's class with an anticipation he hadn't felt in centuries. Terraforming the quad. It was absurd, reckless, and potentially disastrous. It was also, he had to admit, absolutely fascinating. The day of Jane's terraforming demonstration dawned bright and clear, or at least it would have if the entire campus wasn't currently enveloped in a swirling vortex of artificially generated atmosphere. Xexilorp made his way across the quad, marveling at the transformation. Where once there had been neatly manicured lawns and tidy walkways, now there was a roiling landscape of alien terrain. To his left, a bubbling pool of what appeared to be liquid methane belched noxious fumes into the air. To his right, crystalline structures sprouted from the ground, growing and shifting before his eyes. Students from every department had gathered to witness the spectacle. Some wore environment suits, while others had opted for more creative forms of protection. Xexilorp spotted a group of art students who had encased themselves in transparent bubbles of hardened resin, turning themselves into living sculptures. As he approached the center of the quad, Xexilorp caught sight of Jane. She was perched atop a hovering platform, surrounded by a dizzying array of holographic displays and control panels. Her hair, wilder than ever, crackled with static electricity, and her eyes gleamed with the light of scientific madness. Professor Z. Jane called out, waving enthusiastically, "Isn't it beautiful? We've got atmospheres ranging from ammonia-based to chlorine-rich, gravity fluctuations simulating everything from gas giants to microplanetoids, and even a small-scale magnetic field generator to demonstrate solar-wind interactions." Xexilorp had to admit it was impressive. Terrifying and potentially catastrophic, yes, but impressive nonetheless. "Jane," he began, choosing his words carefully, "while I appreciate your enthusiasm, don't you think this might be a bit excessive for a class demonstration?" Jane's laughter rang out across the transformed quad. "Excessive? Professor Z, we're barely scratching the surface. Did you know that humans have been dreaming about terraforming other planets for centuries? This is just a small taste of what we hope to achieve someday." Before Xexilorp could respond, a commotion near the edge of the quad caught his attention. A group of Rigelian students, their crystalline bodies glittering in the artificial light, were excitedly clustered around a patch of ground. Jane, one of them, called out, its voice a melodious chime. "Something's happening over here." In an instant, Jane was off her platform and bounding across the quad, leaping over pools of bubbling liquid and ducking under floating globules of plasma with practiced ease. Xexilorp followed as quickly as his multiple legs would allow, curiosity overriding his usual caution. As they reached the group of Rigelians, Xexilorp saw what had caused the excitement. A small patch of the quad, no larger than a dinner plate, had transformed into a miniature ecosystem. Tiny plants, unlike anything native to the university's planet, were sprouting from the soil. Minuscule creatures scurried among the leaves, and a thin mist hung in the air above the patch. Jane's eyes widened with wonder. It's a micro-Earth, she breathed, her voice filled with awe. The combination of atmospheric conditions, soil composition, and electromagnetic fields must have created a perfect analog for Earth's biosphere. The Rigelian students chittered excitedly, their crystalline bodies resonating with curiosity. One of them extended a delicate appendage towards the miniature ecosystem, only to snatch it back with a yelp as a tiny, aggressive-looking insect took a bite out of its crystal lattice. "Fascinating," Jane exclaimed, pulling out a device that looked like a cross between a microscope and a particle accelerator. "It seems the micro-Earth is generating its own defensive mechanisms. The rate of adaptation is off the charts." Xenobiology watched in amazement as the tiny Earth ecosystem began to expand, slowly but steadily encroaching on the alien terrain around it. Where it touched the crystalline structures or pools of exotic liquids, it seemed to absorb and incorporate them, growing more complex and diverse with each passing moment. Jane Xenobiology said, a note of concern creeping into his voice, "Should we be worried about this growth?" But Jane was too engrossed in her observations to hear him. She was rattling off a stream of data and hypotheses, her words coming so fast that even Xenobiology's advanced translator struggled to keep up. Exponential growth rate, adaptive radiation, accelerated evolution. It's like watching millions of years of Earth's history play out in minutes. The micro-Earth continued to expand, now covering an area the size of a small pond. Tiny mountain ranges thrust up from the soil, minuscule oceans formed and churned, and microscopic creatures grew and evolved at an alarming rate. It was beautiful, terrifying, and utterly mesmerizing. Students from all corners of the quad had gathered to watch the spectacle, their differences forgotten in the face of this unprecedented phenomenon. Venusians floated alongside Rigelians, Andromedans, tentacles intertwined with Betelgeusian pseudopods, all watching in awe as a miniature version of humanity's homeworld bloomed before their eyes. Suddenly, a shout rang out from the back of the crowd. "Look up there." All eyes turned skyward. The swirling vortex of artificial atmosphere that Jane had created was beginning to change. Patterns were forming in the clouds, spiraling and coalescing into recognizable shapes. To Xenobiology's astonishment, he realized he was looking at a map of Earth's continents, writ large across the sky. Its beautiful breathed the nearby Andromedan, its translucent skin shimmering with emotion. Jane, her eyes shining with a mixture of scientific excitement and something deeper, more profound, turned to address the assembled crowd. "This," she said, her voice carrying across the transformed quad. "This is why we explore, why we experiment, why we push boundaries, because in doing so we don't just learn about other worlds, we learn about ourselves." She gestured to the micro-Earth, now a thriving miniature world teeming with life, and then to the sky, where the continents of Earth swirled in majestic patterns. Every planet, every ecosystem, every form of life in this vast universe has a story to tell. And when we listen, really listen, we find that those stories aren't so different from our own. A hush fell over the crowd as Jane's words sank in. Xenobiology felt something stir within him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in centuries of teaching, the pure, unadulterated thrill of discovery. The moment was broken by a familiar bellow from the edge of the quad. "What in the name of all that's holy is going on here?" Dean Silthrak had arrived, his tentacles flailing in agitation as he took in the transformed landscape. But before he could launch into what promised to be an epic tirade, he caught sight of the micro-Earth and the swirling continents in the sky. His mouth, all three of them, snapped shut in mid-rant. For a long moment, the Dean stood silent, his eye stalks swiveling between the miniature world on the ground and the majestic display above. When he finally spoke, his voice was uncharacteristically soft. "In all my years," he murmured, "I've never seen anything like this." Jane, seizing the moment, bounded over to the Dean. "Isn't it amazing? We've created a working model of planetary formation and evolution. Think of the research possibilities, the advancements in xenobiology and planetary science." The Dean, still staring at the swirling continents overhead, nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, as if coming out of a trance. "Yes, I suppose it is rather extraordinary." Xenobiology, sensing a shift in the wind, decided to press the advantage. "Dean Silthrak," he said, placing a tentacle on the Arcturian's shoulder, "I believe this demonstration has shown us the true value of Jane's unconventional methods. Perhaps it's time we reconsidered our approach to interspecies education." The Dean was quiet for a long moment, his eye stalks still fixed on the sky. Finally, he turned to Jane. "Ms. Jane," he said, his voice a mixture of resignation and grudging respect, "I believe I owe you an apology. Your methods may be unorthodox, but the results," he gestured to the transformed quad, the engaged students, the miniature world still growing at their feet. "The results speak for themselves." A cheer went up from the assembled students. Jane, her face split in a wide grin, launched into an impromptu lecture on the implications of their accidental discovery. Xenobiology watched as students from a dozen different species clustered around her, their questions and observations overlapping in a cacophony of interstellar scientific discourse. As the day wore on and the excitement showed no signs of abating, Xenobiology found himself reflecting on the strange journey that had led to this moment. When Jane had first arrived in his class, he had seen her as a potential disaster waiting to happen. Now, looking at the transformed quad, the engaged students, and the literal new world blooming at their feet, he realized she was something else entirely. Jane, with her boundless enthusiasm and disregard for the impossible, represented the very best of what humanity had to offer the galaxy. She was a force of nature, yes, but one that brought life, excitement, and a burning curiosity to everything she touched. As the artificial sun began to set on their transformed world, painting the swirling continents in the sky with hues of gold and crimson, Xenobiology made a decision. He would fight to keep Jane in his class, to nurture her wild ideas and channel her enthusiasm, because if this was what one human could accomplish in a single semester, he couldn't wait to see what she'd do next. The galaxy, Xenobiology realized, would never be the same, and that perhaps was the greatest lesson of all. Epilogue. Years later, long after Jane had graduated and moved on to revolutionize the field of xenobiology, new students at the Galactic University of Sciences would still speak in hushed tones about the Day of a Thousand Worlds. They would point to the small, thriving ecosystem that remained in the center of the quad, now a protected research site, and tell tales of the human who had turned their understanding of the universe upside down. And in his office, surrounded by holograms of distant planets and strange new lifeforms, Professor Xenobiology would smile to himself as he read the latest reports from the Jane Kingston Center for Interstellar Terraforming. The galaxy might not have been ready for humanity, he mused, but humanity had certainly been ready for the galaxy. As he turned his gaze to the window, where the swirling continents still danced across the sky, a permanent reminder of that fateful day, Xenobiology couldn't help but chuckle. He had set out to teach a class about life in the universe, but in the end, it was a human who had taught them all what it truly meant to be alive. And somewhere out there, in the vast expanse of space, Jane was undoubtedly causing beautiful chaos, one explosion at a time. As the years passed, the legend of Jane Kingston and her transformative semester at Galactic University only grew. Her exploits became the stuff of academic folklore, whispered about in dormitories and debated in faculty lounges across the galaxy. Blurgax, once content to ooze lazily through life, went on to become a leading researcher in extreme environment adaptations. His groundbreaking work on gelatinous lifeforms in high-pressure deep-sea vents earned him the prestigious Galactic Science Award, which he proudly displayed in a specially designed high-viscosity case. Grelnock, the timid Andromedan, found his calling in diplomatic relations. His experiences in Jane's class had taught him that fear could be transformed into curiosity, a lesson he applied to great effect in negotiating peace treaties between traditionally hostile species. He often cited the Day of a Thousand Worlds as the moment he realized that differences could be a source of strength rather than conflict. Dean Silthrak, much to everyone's surprise, became the galaxy's most vocal advocate for educational reform. His impassioned speeches about the need for controlled chaos in the classroom drew both acclaim and bafflement from academic circles. He retired several decades later, but not before establishing the annual Interstellar Science Fair, where students were encouraged to push the boundaries of what was considered possible or safe in the name of discovery. As for Professor Xenobiology, he continued to teach Xenobiology 101. But the class was never quite the same. Each semester, he would begin by recounting the tale of the human who had turned the university upside down, and doing so, had given them all a new perspective on the universe. His students would listen with rapt attention, their eye stalks or equivalent sensory organs wide with wonder, and sometimes on quiet evenings when the swirling continents in the sky seemed particularly vivid, Xenobiology would make his way to the quad. He would stand before the thriving micro-Earth, now the size of a small lake and home to an entire ecosystem of unique lifeforms. As he watched the tiny creatures go about their lives, evolving and adapting at an accelerated pace, he would feel a familiar spark of excitement, because Jane had taught him more than just the wonders of Earth biology. She had reminded him of something he had almost forgotten in his centuries of teaching, that the universe was vast and strange and beautiful, and that there was always more to discover. And somewhere out there, Xenobiology knew Jane Kingston was still pushing boundaries, still asking questions, still causing the occasional controlled explosion. The thought made him smile. As he turned to head back to his office, Xenobiology paused. On a whim, he pulled out a small device, a gift from Jane before she had graduated. With a chuckle, he pressed the button. A tiny, perfectly formed mushroom cloud blossomed in the air before him, accompanied by a tinny recording of Jane's laughter. "To remember me by, Professor Zed," her voice rang out. "Never stop questioning, never stop exploring, and never, ever be afraid to make a little noise in the name of science." Xenobiology shook his head, all 7 of his hearts filled with a mixture of exasperation and fondness. "Oh, Jane," he murmured to himself, "as if anyone could ever forget you." And with that, he made his way back to his office, already planning the next semester's curriculum. After all, there was a whole new generation of students to inspire, A whole universe of wonders to explore. And who knew? Maybe there was another Jane out there, just waiting to turn the galaxy upside down all over again. The end, or perhaps just the beginning.